Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Ave Maria Press Professional Development Webinar Series. In today's webinar, Bob Schuchts will discuss a Catholic vision for understanding sexual wholeness with a unique application of John Paul II's theology of the body. My name is Erin Pierce. I am the Parish and Curriculum Marketing Specialist at Ave Maria Press. Everyone in the audience is muted today, but you are able to ask questions. You can send questions to the presenter using this questions box here on the GoToWebinar panel, and I'll read as many of those as possible at the end of the presentation today. The webinar is being recorded, and I will send you the recording tomorrow via email. With that, I would like to welcome and introduce our presenter today. Bob Schuchts is the best-selling author of Be Healed, Be Transformed, Be Devoted, and his newest book, Be Restored. He is the founder of the John Paul II Healing Center in Tallahassee, Florida, and co-host of the Restore the Glory podcast with Jake Kim. After receiving his doctorate in family relations from Florida State University, Schuchts became a teacher and counselor. While in private practice, he also taught graduate and undergraduate courses at FSU and Tallahassee Community College. Schuchts later served on faculty at the Theology of the Body Institute and at the Center for Biblical Studies, where he taught courses on healing, sexuality, and marriage, and was a guest instructor for the Augustine Institute. Bob, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Erin. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter. So something will pop up on your screen.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And
don't see anything. There we go.
There we go. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let you take it from here.
Okay, thank you. Everybody, I don't see my PowerPoint yet. Here we go. Can you see it? Can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
I just clicked off. There we go. So our topic today is sexual healing and wholeness. It's related to, but not in any way directly connected to my book, Be Restored, which is the most recent book. But just this idea of sexual healing and wholeness is so critical to where we are in the church right now, and also where we are as a culture. And I think everybody would agree in our culture we need a lot of sexual healing and wholeness. But I think we also can see it in the church, and if we look close enough, we can also see it in ourselves. And I can say when I went to graduate school back in the 70s, I had no training whatsoever, and I was being trained to be a therapist, but I had no training whatsoever in the area of sexual wounds or sexual healing or a vision for sexual wholeness. In fact, it was a very crazy time in that point in the 70s. It was, within a decade of the sexual revolution, and even everybody in the school was living in kind of crazy sexual understanding. The half of the graduate students in marriage and family divorced by the time they graduated, and the only half that stayed together were those who were in Christian marriages. And so if you didn't have that, it was really a time to have a lot of confusion. And I can remember going to national conventions, and the professors were having affairs in marriage and family. They were having affairs at the national conventions. I can remember one of the couples in our group, in our program, swinging. It's starting to come back some, but open marriage is another word for it. It was just a really crazy time. And so it was kind of ironic that with all of that sexual brokenness going on all around us, there was no teaching on healing sexual brokenness. And I think there was maybe even some illusion in that sexual independence of the 60s and 70s, that there were no consequences, that there was no need for healing, that there was a need for freedom, that the only healing that was needed was being freed from the restraints of the church and the culture. But as we have come to discover, that's far from reality. So I want to propose to you that we all experience sexual brokenness. And here are at least some of the ways in which that happens. One is original sin. You know, beginning with original sin, we all have concupiscence. And with concupiscence, there's the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and pride that covers that reality up. And so it's in humility, as we come into an understanding through the Holy Spirit, in humility, we come to see that each of us, are subject to pride, are subject to lust of the eyes and lust of the flesh. And so that all of us, from the very beginning, are prone to sexual brokenness. And then, as I mentioned, the cultural influences, sexual revolution, and what we're living in right now, referred to as the woke culture, which is, again, a redefinition based on the sexual revolution. But we've now come, kind of full maturity, if you will, of the sexual revolution, where the understanding of sexuality and the denial of the consequences of where we are as a quote unquote woke culture is just blinding. And we also see, not just in the culture, but in church influences. And for years, the influences of Puritanism and Jansenism, which is kind of a denial of the goodness of sexuality, which I think John Paul II's Theology of the Body has really rectified in many ways. But there's still that element in the church of Puritanism or Jansenism, which is an overly repressed understanding of sexuality. And then all of us know that we've been experiencing the brokenness as a church, as a community, because of the sexual abuse scandals. And it's not just the sexual abuse scandals of the priests, but it's of all of us. It's all of our sexual sin that brings scandal to the name of Christ. And not only our sexual sin, but our sexual brokenness that is unhealed, which keeps us from being able to live the fullness of our faith. And then we see that just the rampant increase in pornography and the sexual imagery and the exploitation that's involved in that. And as we'll talk about, there's disordered desires in every one of these areas of sexual brokenness, but the disordered desires and imagery going together creates an exploitation of each other and of sexuality, rather than seeing it as a gift, seeing each person as a gift, rather than recognizing the dignity of the human person. And that then flows out in terms of sexual sin and compulsions. And again, this is just rampant. We even as a culture are denying the reality of sexual sin, as there's any such thing. And at the same time, we can't deny the fact that those who enter into sexual sins almost always, over a period of time, get locked into sexual compulsion. And we're seeing, as a therapist for many years, but particularly since the onset of internet pornography, we're seeing how difficult it is for those who have a conversion and want to have freedom from those compulsions and from sin, and how trapping those become. And then the effect of all of that is sexual wounds. And so if I want to propose to you that there's two kinds of sexual wounds that all of us have probably experienced. And I don't want to put it all in the same bucket, because obviously we know people who have experienced extreme sexual violations and extreme psychosexual deprivations. But all of us, to some degree or another, in a fallen world, have experienced this directly or indirectly. And so what are sexual violations? There are two types. One is sexual abuse, and the other is sexual sin. And you could say that sexual sin is sexual abuse, and sexual abuse is sexual sin. But I just want to differentiate between these two, because one is being the recipient of it, and the other is being the cause of it. So in sexual abuse, I want to define this very broadly for a minute. anything that violates our boundaries and our dignity as human persons. Okay, so if you think about the extremes of that, you know, something at the extreme level would be pedophilia or rape or an experience of incest. Uh, Sexual trafficking obviously is a definition of sexual abuse. But I think there are other forms of sexual abuse that we maybe not call abuse, which is something called emotional incest, or I guess we're becoming more aware of it as, you know, uh, sexual violation in words or in looks or in comments or in conversation. And so you can see this even in our movies and television and, you know, with pornography, everything else. There's a tremendous amount of violation of our dignity as persons, and also the boundaries, the human boundaries, anything that crosses over human boundaries of dignity and respect. And then sexual sin is anything that violates, even when there's consent, anything that violates God's design for sexuality is sexual sin. And so if you think about uh, the ways in which, you know, from the earliest time in life, and I would encourage you, it's one of the things I do in Be Restored is to really give us all an opportunity to examine this in our own life, because we can't really help other people, be compassionate for other people until we've really looked and experienced God's love and mercy in these areas of our own life. But anything that violates his design for sexuality becomes a sexual sin. And again, some more damaging and consequential, but all sexual sin is a violation in some way or another of our dignity of persons. And then something we don't often think about in terms of sexual wounds are psychosexual deprivations. And these are wounds in our development, wounds in the way that we've received love and then learned to love as we grow up. And we're becoming much more aware these days of attachment wounds. And it's as I'm working with people in my practice in the years past and in our conferences now, uh, there's an amazing correlation between attachment wounds and sexual compulsions and sexual sins. It seems like where there are attachment wounds, there's a real vulnerability to find a fulfilling a need, an unmet need there that you know, goes towards pornography or goes towards sexual sin, or is even more vulnerable to sexual abuse. We're finding that the people with big attachment wounds are much more prone to sexual abuse experiences because there's not that protection and there's not that sense of connection. With that, and flowing out of attachment wounds, usually in the next couple of years of life, are identity wounds. These are a loss of healthy role models of same sex and opposite sex, and then the affirmation of our identity, of our gender. And again, we're seeing a lot of woundedness in this area right now in our culture. You know, again, the culture kind of increases that and perpetuates that, but there's very real breakdown of the family. There's very real breakdown of healthy role modeling, and so there are and affirmation, and so there's really genuine wounds that happen early in life that can manifest themselves in all kind of different ways. And then there's shame over sexual desires that you know, usually becomes visible in prepubescent and adolescent times, and with it can be a loss of healthy self-mastery, and it goes in one of two different directions. It can go in the direction of repression of sexual desire, where we begin to disdain and hate our sexual desire. And if many people say that they were brought up kind of in a Jansenism or Puritanism approach and began to feel like their desires themselves were evil. And so repressing those desires, and then they um, enter into marriage without ever having uh, understood and experienced the goodness of their sexual desire, and then find it difficult to enter into lovemaking in marriage, or even in consecrated life, you know, where there isn't sexual expression in a genital sense, but there's an inability to have affective, healthy relationships with members of the same and opposite sex. So all of these are areas of our sexual wounds. And I lay these all out because I think we tend to think of only the top one, sexual abuse, as being having sexual wounds, but all these areas are areas where we're sexually wounded. So with that, we've kind of lost a vision for sexual wholeness in the culture. I think that's safe to say the culture has certainly lost it. And thank God for St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, because in it he restores a healthy and a whole vision of our sexuality and what the path of sexual healing needs to take. And so some of you may be very familiar with Theology of the Body, and some of you not so much. So just kind of a highlight what he talks about in original man, which is man before original sin. And he talks about three dimensions of our sexual wholeness. He says the first is original solitude, then original unity, and then original innocence. So original solitude, original unity, and original innocence. And our original solitude is primarily in relationship with God, where we develop both identity, a clear identity of who we are as a man or as a woman, but as a person, first and foremost. And then our security, our sense of being loved and having our identity as beloved sons and daughters. And this is really foundational for sexual health. With that security and identity, we then have the capacity for original unity, which is, when Adam and Eve discover each other as man and woman. And so in original unity, there's a complementarity and communion. There's a capacity to give and receive love. Again, this is before the fall, where there's no woundedness, there's no brokenness. There's just pure, holy communion. And in that communion, there's a sense of mature relationship with others. We develop this healthy maturity, and maturity is the capacity to give and receive love. And as we grow in our capacity, we then have a mutuality. We then have a communion that develops out of that. And then finally, original innocence. He talks about this state of being naked without shame. And in that original innocence, it's primarily a relationship with ourself before others and God. And it's the development of integrity, or another word for this is integration. The Catechism talks about chastity is the integration of the person and the integrality of the gift of sexuality. That's all part of original innocence. And it's in relationship with ourselves, we have a sense of purity. And so you can see, if this is what God envisions for our sexuality, that all of us struggle in areas of sexual brokenness in each of these areas. And I just love this quote from St. John Paul II in his Theology of the Body, 28:5. And just take a second to really let this sink in, because it explains a whole lot of what we experience in life. He says, the birth of shame orients us towards the moment in which the inner man, the heart, by closing itself to what comes from the Father, opens itself to what comes from the world. Okay, just let me break that down a little bit. The birth of shame, we all know what shame is like. Shame is that sense of I have to hide. There's something about me that's unacceptable. There's something about me that's worthy to be rejected or condemned. Self-hatred, self-rejection, hiding, all those are aspects of shame. Shame orients us to close off to the Father. That is, close off from the communion we have in that original innocence and the original communion and in the original solitude. And when we close off to the Father, we then look to the world to satisfy what only the Father can really satisfy. And this is the origin of our sexual brokenness. This happened right at the beginning of mankind at the fall. And John Paul II is so clear as he lays this out in the second section on historical man. So what happens if you remember the three areas of solitude, communion, and innocence? What happens is with shame, we have a loss of the image of God. We have a distorted identity. And then we have gender confusion and gender dysphoria. Okay, those are, again, we've become much more aware of them in our culture right now, but those are aspects of a broken image of God. We've lost our our image in relation to God. We've distorted our identity in relation to who God says we are in creation. And this isn't just about the confusion that's inherent in some of the extremes, but it's for all of us. There's places where we lose our sense of who we are. Just in a conversation with a group of men before, they were talking about achieving as a way to get affirmation of their identity rather than being affirmed in who they are as men. And this is true for men and women and everybody. And so when we lose that original solitude with God, we lose and distort our clear sense of God's image and our own identity, which results in confusion. Secondly, with the loss of communion, we have a loss of trust. And again, think about what happens in the areas that I talked about in terms of sexual wounds. What happens when attachment isn't secure for an infant or a young child? They lose the capacity to trust. Fear comes in. Broken communion. There's a loss of relationship. Same thing if somebody's sexually abused, sexually violated. There's a loss of trust. Even in our own sexual sins, two couples before marriage who have sexual intimacy and then break that intimacy off, they have a loss of trust going into the next relationship. There's a loss of capacity for communion. And we see this over and over in the healing, that those areas need to be healed. Even when people think there's nothing wrong with it, they still experience the consequences, even if they don't have a concept of sin or communion. And what is sin but the loss of communion? And out of that loss of trust, we develop disordered desires. There's lust, which is, again, product of concupiscence, but there's also from that compulsions that we talked about before. And then sin. And all of that results in a loss of innocence. Now we recognize our shame. And there's a disintegration. There's a loss of integrity. There's a loss of wholeness, which is why it's sexual brokenness. And that creates trauma. Again, there is trauma in the loss of integration, but it's also loss of integration as a result of trauma, as a result of those sexual violations. We lose our sense of innocence and we develop a sense of shame. And again, the sense of shame is I'm bad, I'm dirty, I'm unworthy, I'm perverted, there's something wrong with me, I'm inherently defective. All of those are ways in which we carry shame around. And the effect of shame is not only that it leaves us feeling bad about ourselves and wanting to hide, but it also leaves us judging others and unable to fully receive from others because the shame blocks that capacity. So what does sexual healing look like? It is integrating God's truth, which is why the church's teaching is so important in this world, and why the scriptures, understanding God's truth, God's order, is really necessary, that we need to integrate that into our life. But all of us falling short of his justice, we also need to integrate God's mercy into our sexual identity, into our sexual desires, and into our sexual experiences. So every area in our life, this is what sexual healing is. Every area of our life needs to be confronted by God's truth. To justify an area of our life where there's been sexual wounds or sexual sin and deny the truth of God is to leave us in disordered desires and disordered disintegration. But when we acknowledge his truth, and I've seen so many people experience this, they go to a theology of the body and just marvel at the truth and feel like it's just this washing and cleansing of pure water over areas and history of sexual brokenness and sexual sin. And yet there gets to be this awareness of shame and this awareness of a helplessness to heal those wounds. And that's where God's mercy is critical. It's his mercy, his heart for our misery, misericordia, his heart for our misery, his heart for our brokenness. And we think God is repelled by those areas in our life, but he's actually drawn to them. It's actually why he came. He comes into the places of our suffering. Everything in Jesus' life demonstrates his love for us in the places of our suffering. And he goes to those who are living in shame and living as outcasts, living with disordered desires. We see it all the way through the scriptures. The woman at the well, the woman caught in adultery, Zacchaeus, David. It's over and over and over again. When we acknowledge the truth of God and acknowledge the ways we fall short of God's truth, then it's his mercy that's necessary. Because to recognize the truth and either to experience others throwing stones at us or us throwing stones at ourselves in condemnation is to stay stuck. It's to stay in the brokenness. So what does that look like? It looks like, in terms of those three areas that we have been talking about, John Paul II laid out, there needs to be in sexual healing restoration at all three areas where there's been damage. And this is really important. And I don't think we adequately, as a church, and even those professionally who work with those with sexual brokenness, I don't think we adequately address all three of these areas. And so I just encourage you to think about what this looks like in our own lives, but also in those we minister to. What does it mean to restore identity? And basically, this is the gift of preaching, but also the gift of witness in our lives. And it's God's truth communicated with compassion, bringing about greater confidence and clarity in our masculine and feminine uniqueness and in the complementarity of the sexes. Again, right now, that truth is so opposed, and partly because we haven't communicated it as a church with sufficient compassion. But even with compassion, uh, the culture wants to communicate a false compassion. It wants to deny God's image, God's truth about identity, and give a woke version of that. But when we communicate God's truth, we always need to do it with a boldness, but also with a compassion. And with that brings confidence, faith in God, brings clarity, and brings complementarity. And we then are able to live more fully in our masculine and feminine uniqueness before God, restoring that original solitude, that original sense of who I am before God. Second thing that needs to be restored is our communion, our capacity for communion. And I find that this is only restored relationally by healthy attachment. We can talk about the truth all day long, but unless, and this is where Pope Francis talks about accompaniment, unless we're accompanying people in their brokenness with truth and compassion, there's not going to be a restoration of the capacity for communion. We just can't will ourselves to communion where the areas of our heart have been damaged and wounded. We can will ourselves to be open to it. So what brings about restoration and healing is God's tender love and kindness. Okay, not God's judgment. God's judgment is part of his truth, but God's tender love is hesed and kindness, directly mediated through the Holy Spirit, through Jesus, but also mediated through mature people who have walked this walk, who are not in denial about their own sexual brokenness and about the love of God, who have walked through this walk, have developed a capacity for maturity, for communion, for self-giving love, for intimacy, for being known, so that as we're sexually wounded in those kind of relationships, spiritual mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and spiritual children, we can have healthy attachment and develop a greater capacity for trust and self-giving love. I can't emphasize this enough. I think it's something that we have missed a lot in the church as we're calling people into holiness. We're not walking with people to help bring about that holiness, and many of us haven't had people walk with us in those areas. And if we have, we can be very grateful for the trust that's restoring and the communions that's restoring. And so let's go to the last one, which is restoring innocence. Innocence only comes not by denying our brokenness, but by experiencing God's mercy permeating to the very depths of our sin, to our trauma and our shame. So when we go to confession, and obviously that's the beginning and very important part of the sacramental grace of restoring innocence. But my experience is that few people leave confession and get down to the very roots of their sin, trauma, and shame. It's not the intention of confession for the most part. It's meant to deal with shame in a large way and restore the prodigal son to the father and allow the father to embrace the son, daughter in our sin. But there's a deeper healing that needs to take place in those areas of our shame. Because what we've discovered is that trauma and shame become the source and support of sexual compulsion and sexual sin. So if we're trying to overcome sin, but we haven't dealt with the trauma, both types of trauma, both sexual violations and psychosexual deprivations, those are both traumas, and the shame that we receive from both sides, if we're not dealing with that, and shame from our sin, if we're not dealing with those and healing those, we're going to stay stuck in the pattern of sin and compulsion. If we can have that mercy penetrate to those areas, then our sexual desires can become transformed and we can be restored in purity. Okay, I realize this is a lot of information, but I want to kind of lay out the whole picture for you, and then we can kind of clarify it when you have questions in a few minutes. So let's go to the next one. This is from my book, Be Restored. It's kind of a summary of the first part of Be Restored and an introduction to the second part of Be Restored, where we talk about the healing process. But oftentimes in the church, what we deal with is sexual sin, and we stop there. But it's only the tip of the iceberg, or the top of the pyramid, if you want to put it that way. Underneath, well, first of all, as we get into habitual sexual sin, let's say pornography, or let's say it's sexual intercourse outside of marriage, or homosexual relationships, or adultery, whatever those sexual sins are, there are many, incest, they cause compulsions and they result from compulsions. And so if we're going to really understand our sexual sin and our tendency towards sexual sin, we need to look at our sexual compulsion, starting with concupiscence, that compulsion that happens from the very beginning of our broken communion with God, but also that compulsion that's increased because of our sexual sin. And Jesus said, he who sins becomes a slave of sin. So we find ourselves, no matter what that area of sin is, that we find ourselves stuck and trapped in a compulsion to sin. And so if you have people coming to you who are addressing sexual sin and you're wanting to help them overcome sexual sin, we need to walk to the next level, which is looking at the areas of compulsions. Underneath the compulsions, there's always gender identity distortions. Again, starting at the fall. But again, whether it's extreme levels of identity distortions, like gender dysphoria, or if there's, more hidden gender identity distortions, just a lack of confidence in our identity as a man or as a woman. Whatever those distortions are, they actually drive sexual compulsions. And I go a lot more into this in Be Restored, so I can't, in this brief seminar, go into the depths of why that is. But I've seen it over and over and over again. When the identity distortions are healed, then the sexual compulsions can be healed and the sexual sins can be liberated. And what causes those gender identity distortions? Two things: sexual abuse and betrayal traumas. Betrayal trauma is something like a divorce, or an early death, or a broken relationship before marriage, or an adultery. I can say in my own life, I experienced my dad's adultery as a betrayal trauma, not just to my mom, but to each of us as brothers and sisters. And those betrayal traumas break trust and also wound our identity, wound the natural development that would take place in growing in our identity. And sexual abuse experiences. And I didn't have overt sexual abuse experience in terms of the way some have experienced terrible trauma, but I had a basketball coach when I was in 8th grade tried to molest me, didn't succeed, but tried to molest me. But that was a trauma. That was a betrayal trauma. And so all sexual abuse brings betrayal trauma, but there's betrayal trauma that's more than our own personal experiences of abuse. But those sexual abuse and betrayal traumas drive gender identity distortions, drive sexual compulsions, and become the source of sexual sins. Even though sexual sins are chosen, they in some ways become pushed by these, if you will, compulsive because of these. And then underneath all of this, as I mentioned before, is the wounds and psychosexual development. If we're going to look at healing and sexual restoration, we can't stop at any of these stages. We need to deal with all of these areas. And again, that's what I address in Be Restored. And there's many other good sources of looking at all these areas of healing that are necessary. Don't want that to be discouraging in any way. Want that to be encouraging. The reason if you've been going to confession for a particular sexual sin like pornography or fantasy or masturbation or something like that, and you haven't been able to get free, it's not because you're a bad person. It's because there's all these things that need healing for that freedom to happen. So let's go to the next. So this is the progression in the healing journey, and I talk about this a lot in our Holy Desire courses, and we offer these mostly for priests and seminarians, but it's available to everybody through our website if you want to look for that. It's called Holy Desire. But healing proceeds progressively through those different layers that I just identified of sexual sins, compulsions, identity distortions, and sexual wounds. And I find this to be extremely helpful. I bring this up at the beginning of every one of our Holy Desire conferences, also talk about it in Be Restored. But I want you to ponder this in your own life and in the lives of the people you know who are struggling in areas of their sexuality. Behind every sexual sin and disordered desire, which is what a compulsion is a holy desire. I had talked about this on my podcast with Jay Kim a couple of podcasts ago, talking about healing from pornography. And I had a man come up at my last conference who's an athlete, and he said it set him free to hear this, that behind his sexual compulsion, sexual sin is a holy desire. It allowed him to move beyond his shame to begin to look at, oh, what is it I'm really looking for? Just as an example, when somebody, G.K. Chesterton said, somebody goes to a brothel, they're looking for God. They're desiring love. They're desiring to be wanted. They're desiring wholeness. And so oftentimes, that holy desire reveals an unmet need. There's a desire that hasn't been met, either in the present or in the past or both. And so we need to address not only what's behind our sexual sin and disordered desires, call them what they are and repent from them, and then look for where the holy desire is and where are the unmet needs in our life that we're trying to express. And I can tell you, I've never met anybody who's fantasized in an unholy way or looked at pornography that wasn't coming from an unmet need and looking for a desire that they hadn't had met. And a lot of times that's because of an unhealed wound in their life. There are deep wounds, all the things we mentioned up above, that are driving those sexual sins and disordered desires. So as I'm walking with somebody or helping somebody in a conference walk through this process, I want them to see where the holy desire is, because this is where the shame can get opened up and we can see the goodness of our desire. We can look at our unmet need. We can look at the hidden, unhealed wound, and then usually a hidden pattern of sin. There's a book called Unwanted by Jay Stringer that I would recommend. And he talks about behind lust, there's always a hidden pattern of sin and unforgiveness. I've had to start to really think about that in my own life and in the lives of the people I was working with, but I think there's true. Oftentimes we're focused on the sexual sin and not seeing the deeper sins of broken communion and anger and bitterness and resentment and envy and all those other areas of sin. So these also need to be addressed in the healing journey. So finally, what's the fruit of this healing process? And I'll turn it over for question and answers right after this. One is as we walk through our own healing process, and I described it as experiencing God's truth and compassion, his mercy in the areas of our sin and shame, and then also a restoration of those areas. What do? We develop self-acceptance. That's really critical, that we come to accept ourselves, not justify our sin. That's not self-acceptance. Not justify or deny our wounds, but accept ourselves so that we'll no longer need to hide in shame. We need people around us that are safe enough, that won't condemn us, that'll love us, that'll show us God's mercy, that we can, really come and reveal who we are. And I think a lot of the reason why we have the issues in our culture right now with uh, the woke, quote unquote theology, is because people want a place to go with their shame. They don't want to live in hiding anymore. And so we begin to justify areas that are distorted as though they're okay, rather than having safe places within the church to be able to come and say, here is where I struggle, here is where I need love, here is where I'm living in shame and I want to be free of this shame. Again, the confessional is one place, but I think we need it in community also, in in those true relationships of love and mercy. With that self-acceptance, we can be honest. We can realize our sexual brokenness is endemic to the human condition. We don't have to think that we're the only ones that has sexual brokenness. When my eyes started to open in my 20s and looking at my history of sexual brokenness, I realized that, boy, I've been in a lot of denial. And, it didn't help to repress my sexual brokenness or deny it or hold it in shame, that there was reality to it. And I could look at it and I could look at it honestly and accept myself where I had been living in shame and fear. With that comes a lot of gratitude. Uh, when we begin to accept ourselves and be honest, we begin to be grateful for God's merciful love and his healing power, because now we've opened it up to his love. We're not hiding it anymore. And we begin to experience graciousness, not only God's graciousness towards us, but our graciousness towards ourselves and towards others. And with that, we also realize that healing is a process. And so we develop patience. We become patient with ourselves. And as we're patient with ourselves in our own healing process, we can be patient with others. I heard a priest in a homily a couple weeks ago at our conference say, patience is being able to suffer in the present moment. The reason why we're impatient with ourselves is we don't want to suffer. Patience means long suffering. But healing is a process, is a suffering. It's a redemptive suffering. And as we enter in with patience with ourselves, we then can be patient with others, realizing that they're going through a process too, and that we don't have this demand that they have to be fixed because they can't meet that any more than we can. And then with all of this, we have a growth in wholeness. We develop security. Remember, go back to the original man. We develop security. We know that we're loved. We know what our identity is. We develop maturity. We can grow in communion, capacity to trust, capacity to love, learning how to give and not just grasp and take, which is what lust is. But love is learning self-gift, self-sacrifice, seeing the other as a gift, honoring the other's goodness and beauty. And then all of that results in purity, pure love. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are we on our purity because we become integrated and we see sexuality in an integrated way, which is what the church is teaching. If you want to look in the catechism under life in Christ, it's really what the church teaches about what healing looks like. So with that, I'll turn it over to questions, Aaron.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Bob. I encourage everyone or anyone now to type in questions for Bob. I certainly appreciate your sensitivity on this topic, which is, a large topic and difficult. So we so much appreciate that. And if someone would want to contact you, maybe to dive into this or delve into this a little bit more, how would you direct them?
I would direct them to our website, which is John Paul II Healing Center. We have a lot of resources up there. I obviously can't um, meet with every person or
Sure.
respond to every question, but there is a lot of resources there on our website, and conferences and those kind of things. And um, if there are questions in places where you need referrals, you can also bring those to the um, info at John Paul II Healing Center.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And I'll add that link to the email that goes out tomorrow to everyone. So we have several people on here that work directly with young people who could, benefit obviously from your ministry, from your words. How, what sort of guidance might you give someone who is dealing with young people that are experiencing sexual compulsions and woundedness?
Well, I think all those things that I just mentioned. One is, as you are dealing with your own history, your own story, and experiencing God's compassion, it'll naturally flow out of you for the people that you're working with. And so I think young people need more than anything else safe places to go,
Hmm.
and people who can see them, as Pope Benedict XVI says, in their wholeness, and recognize that their only healing will come from God's love. That's really what heals. When we have eyes to see people in their wholeness, not to find them by their brokenness, but see them according to who they really are, and love them with God's love, that's when they heal. And so, young and old, whatever age we are, we all need that. Uh, with young people, they tend to be a lot less bound by the cultural uh, inhibitions that we grew up with, those of us in the older generation. So they're going to be much more open, but they don't necessarily have a grounding in the truth that some in the older generations have had. And so I think it's really important for that combination of truth and mercy, God's truth and God's mercy.
Hmm.
Uh,
Thank you.
yeah. Jason Everett also has a great ministry to those who working with youth, and we did a podcast together for his Lust is Boring on that question.
Hmm. Okay. I have a question here about, could you please speak to abortion trauma and how this topic could be more integrated into the topic of sexual healing?
Yeah, it's at every point. So it's at the point of not only the post-traumatic experience of abortion, and uh, the um, all the healing programs like Rachel's Vineyard for healing of that trauma. And I would say that when I worked with people as a therapist, it was almost always the last thing that came up in the healing process, because there was so much denial and shame around it. And it didn't matter whether somebody was totally pro-life or totally pro-choice. There was this covering because of the depth of the pain of that trauma. And if somebody was really honest with themselves and they were totally pro-choice, they would still come to face that trauma and realize what they did brought a lot of shame, and they were kind of reacting to the shame with the pro-choice. And similarly, somebody with pro-life that has had an abortion can sometimes be reacting out of that and trying to rectify and justify. But the trauma is severe, but it's not just the trauma of the abortion, it's the trauma of the sexual relationships and the broken relationships and the attachment and relationships that led up to that abortion. And in my experience with people, almost everyone I know who's had an abortion had some kind of an attachment break in their childhood, so that they could get to that place of denial when a child's in their womb, of disconnection from that life, where somebody who has a healthy attachment in their own development uh, would find that much more difficult. It's not that it never happened, but oftentimes I would find that. I also found a lot of sexual abuse and other kinds of traumas that preceded an abortion, um, broken relationships, those kind of things. So there's trauma at every level, and there's healing needed at every level.
Hmm. Thank you. Question here regarding Be Restored. Would it be formatted well to be done in a small group setting?
Yes. What I would recommend, it is recommended either as an individual process or in a small group setting. I would recommend that if it's in a small group setting, that the people go through the questions individually and then choose how much and what to share in the group, depending on the trustworthiness and the intimacy of that group. Because the questions that I ask throughout the book are pretty deep and penetrating. And so if it's a really uh, healthy group where you can have trust and mercy and communion, yeah, it's a beautiful thing to experience in the whole group. If it's unsure, then you can share at some level about the content, but I wouldn't share it to depth until there's that trust developed.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. You mentioned in your presentation that that the church that we could better walk with people who are sexually broken or wounded. Can you give us maybe one insight into how we could do that practically?
Yeah, I'll tell you, so many people that are angry at the church because of the sexual abuse scandal who have been sexually abused by somebody in the church or outside of the church
Mhm.
are angry because everybody wants to deal with them legally and not personally. And I'm finding that that's getting much better. I can tell you stories without identifying people of bishops and priests walking with, or lay people walking with people who've been sexually abused, either by a priest or by a father or a teacher or somebody like that. And it makes all the difference in the world. It just changes everything. And so there's actually two levels of abuse. This is research is coming out with trauma research is coming out. There's the event that happened, and then there's how people react to the person who shares about an event. And trauma research is finding out that the trauma of the second is as great as the trauma of the first,
Mm.
which is really sobering. I mean,
Yes.
that's really eye-opening. But
Yes.
if we have our eyes open to this whole area, then we're going to look at people who've had any kind of sexual brokenness. And again, we've all had sexual brokenness in some way or another, but particularly those who have been most hurt and most damaged and are crying out for help. We're going to have a sensitivity to know that even if we don't have the capacity, that we can love them with our capacity and then help them find the places where they can go to receive that kind of accompaniment.
Hmm. Thank you so much for sharing that. Something I think we all need to hear and to share with others. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great need.
Hmm.
And I have, if I had time, I have beautiful stories that I could tell of people that have walked with others and the healing that's taken place. And it just makes all the difference in the world. What we
Yeah.
need more than anything else is a healing community. The Eucharistic community is meant to be a healing community. And yet we live such separate lives from one another and don't know each other's stories because we're living in a denial about our brokenness,
Hmm. Yeah.
collectively and individually.
Right. Right. Well, thank you again. There's so much here to digest, to reflect on more in prayer, in our interactions with one another, and in our ministry. So I really am so grateful for the time that you've spent with us. And we have some wonderful resources available here, certainly as well as on your website. Your first book that you published with us was Be Healed. Would you recommend maybe people start with that?
Yeah, that's usually if they're not familiar with any of the healing process or the healing ministry, I would start there.
Yeah. And we're so happy to say that it is now in Spanish too.
Yeah,
And that came from people asking you for that, right? They saw that need.
all over. Yeah,
Yes, all
um,
over.
I'm grateful for all of you publishing that in Spanish. Thank you.
Yes, we're happy to do that. So we've got Be Healed, Be Transformed, Be Devoted, and then the newest book, which you spoke on today, Be Restored. So we'd like to offer those books to you, 25% off, using the code for today's date, webinar 1116, when you are ordering at AveMariaPress.com. So we're going to kind of continue this theme here as we move into next week, talking to Eve Tushnet. She'll be joining us to talk about how we can guide gay Catholics to experience the love of God. So please join us for that. Bob, thank you so much. Thank you for all the good that you are doing for God's people. And to everybody who shared this hour with us, we are so grateful. So please join us next week. Thanks
Thank,
again.
thank you, Aaron. Thank you all. God
Bye-bye.
bless you.
Thank you.